Hey guys, so tonight we're going to step into something deeply personal, something intimate. We're going to follow a Roman bride on her final night as an unmarried woman. And honestly, if you've ever wondered what goes through someone's head when their entire life is about to change, when tomorrow everything shifts and there's no going back, well, this is that story. It's a story about silence, about whispered confessions to the night, about a woman standing on the edge of her future and trying to hold on to the past just a little bit longer. Before we dive in, I'd really appreciate it if you could like the video and subscribe. It genuinely means the world to me, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. I find it fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world at all different hours. It's always this strange thing to imagine, you know? People everywhere, all at different times, all watching stories from history unfold together. There's something beautiful about that. Now, take a moment. Dim your lights if you can. Maybe light a candle, because tonight we're stepping back nearly 2,000 years into the candlelit chambers of a Roman home where a young woman is about to become a wife. I want you to really imagine this, not as abstract history, but as something real, something lived. Because that's what this is. This is the story of a real moment, a real person, a real night that mattered. Let's ease into this together. Get comfortable, but not too comfortable, because honestly, this story is about the uncomfortable part, the part where comfort goes away. So lean in a little, stay with me. When you think of ancient Rome, you probably imagine gladiators and emperors, grand forums and marble temples, the Colosseum packed with roaring crowds. But tonight, we're not concerned with any of that. Tonight, we're not interested in the spectacular or the famous. Tonight, we're in a modest home in Rome itself, somewhere in the residential districts where ordinary families lived their ordinary, extraordinary lives. The kind of house that would never make it into the history books, that archaeologists might uncover and find unremarkable, but that held entire worlds inside it. The year is somewhere around the 2nd century. The girl, let's call her Livia, is 17 years old. She's been betrothed since childhood, as was the custom. But like so many things in life, knowing something is coming and actually experiencing it are two entirely different animals. Tomorrow, she will be married to a man she barely knows. A respectable man from a respectable family, yes, but still essentially a stranger. And tonight is her last night of freedom. Well, not freedom exactly. That's probably too generous a word for the life of a Roman girl. But it's her last night of being someone's daughter rather than someone's wife. It's her last night before her entire existence shifts under her feet. The preparations began this morning. Her mother had supervised everything, as mothers do, with that mixture of excitement and melancholy that comes from watching your child step into adulthood. The atrium of their home had been filled with activity since dawn. Servants rushed back and forth with linens and oils and flowers. Livia's younger sisters watched with wide eyes, already imagining their own wedding days years in the future. Her father, characteristically, had made himself scarce. Weddings were women's business. His role would come tomorrow when he walked her to the altar, symbolically handing her over from his guardianship to her husband's. But today he had excused himself to the forum, leaving the household to the female members of the family. And what a household it was. Her aunts had arrived, her cousins, her mother's friends. The home had transformed into something between a celebration and a fever dream. Everyone wanted to offer advice, wisdom, warnings, sometimes all three at once. Some of it was practical, some of it was superstitious. Most of it made her head spin. Now, as evening had fallen and the sun hung low and orange over the city, the house had finally quieted. The servants had been dismissed or sent to other tasks. Her family members had drifted off to their own quarters, recognizing perhaps that Livia needed some space. Some time alone with her thoughts before tomorrow came crashing down on her like a wave. And so she found herself in her bedroom, the one she had occupied since childhood, surrounded by the small comforts and objects that defined her life so far. A doll from childhood stuffed into a corner, now too childish to play with but too meaningful to discard. A small altar to the Lares, the household gods, where she had made private offerings for as long as she could remember. Hairpins her grandmother had given her, scraps of expensive fabric she'd been hoarding, small treasures of a girl's life, tokens of the self she was about to leave behind. The walls of her room had absorbed nearly 18 years of her life. The plaster was pale and simple. No fancy paintings or elaborate mosaics like in the wealthier homes, but it was hers. She knew every corner of it. She knew which floorboards creaked when you stepped on them a certain way. She knew that one spot on the western wall where the light fell in the afternoon and made a perfect rectangle of gold across the floor. She knew the smell of the room, a mix of dried herbs and the oil that kept the wooden shutters smooth. Tomorrow, someone else would probably sleep here. A younger sister might claim it, or it might be converted into something else entirely. Her occupancy would be erased. Her life would be transplanted like a plant uprooted from one garden and placed in another. Soon this room would not be hers anymore. Tomorrow, after the ceremony, she would leave this house and enter her husband's home. She would have new rooms, new servants, new gods to honor, a new life entirely. The finality of it sat heavy on her chest like a stone. Not a small stone either. Something substantial, something that took effort to carry. She had carefully removed her heavy day clothes and changed into something simpler, a linen tunic that fell to her ankles. Her hair, which had been elaborately braided for the day, she had partially undone, letting it fall loose down her back. It tumbled in waves past her shoulders, tangled and free for the first time since morning. The servants had brought water for washing, warm and scented with herbs. She'd soaked her hands and face, taking her time, trying to commit the sensation to memory, small details. The way the herbs smelled like sage and rosemary from her mother's garden, the feel of the warmth on her skin, the water dripping down her wrists, things that belonged to this life, to who she was right now, before everything changed. She rubbed her arms dry with a cloth and just sat for a moment, doing nothing, just existing in the quiet. And then, when she was alone, truly alone, when the last sound of the household had faded and even her mother's servants had retired to their quarters, she had begun to whisper. Quietly at first, testing the words, then with more urgency, as if her thoughts needed to escape into the room before she had to pack them away forever. The words came out like they'd been waiting for this moment, like they'd been building up inside her for weeks, waiting for the right moment to spill out. "I don't want to forget this," she whispered to the darkness, her voice barely above a breath. "I don't want to wake up one day and realize that I can't remember what this felt like. To be just me, Livia, not anyone's wife, not anyone's mother, not anyone's anything, but just me. I want to hold on to this feeling, this moment, right now, before it all changes." She pressed her hands to her chest as if she could physically hold her young self inside. Outside her window, She could hear the sounds of the city settling for the night, the calls of vendors packing up their stalls, the murmur of conversations in the street, the barking of dogs, the normal sounds of a normal evening in Rome. But inside her room, everything felt suspended, waiting, like the world was holding its breath along with her, bracing for what comes next. She moved to the small mirror that hung on her wall, a luxury her family could afford, because her father's business had done well enough. She looked at herself with the intensity of someone saying goodbye. Dark eyes that would still be the same tomorrow, but would somehow look different in her husband's house. The curve of her jaw, the small scar on her left eyebrow from a childhood accident she could barely remember. This face, this body, she was about to share with a man in ways she could barely comprehend. Oh, her mother had given her vague instructions, whispered in the evening with obvious embarrassment. There had been implications of pain, of duty, of things that wives simply endured. But the details were fuzzy, intentionally vague. Perhaps that was merciful. Perhaps it was better not to know exactly what was coming. "Don't cry," she whispered to her reflection, though her eyes were already wet. "Don't cry now. Cry tomorrow if you must. Cry on your wedding night if you need to, but not tonight. Tonight you need to be strong." She had always been told to be strong. Roman girls were taught from childhood that strength was virtue. Stoicism was a mark of good character. Emotional displays were for children and the lower classes. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and forced her shoulders back, straightening her posture even though no one was watching. Habit, learned so deeply, it was automatic. She returned to her bed, a simple frame covered with soft wool blankets. She had spent nearly her entire life in this bed, and tomorrow night she would sleep elsewhere. She lay down, fully clothed, and stared at the shadows playing across her ceiling. The oil lamps cast a gentle light throughout the room, and she focused on the shadows' dance. They moved and shifted, never quite the same, yet always changing. Like life itself, she supposed. Like tomorrow. Like all the tomorrows after that, stretching ahead into a future she couldn't quite see. Her whispers came again, quieter now, more intimate. The darkness seemed to draw the confessions out of her. "I'm terrified," she admitted, and the word hung in the air between her and the unseen listener. The darkness, the gods maybe, herself. "I'm terrified that I won't be good at this, that I'll disappoint him or my family. What if I can't give him children? What if he decides he made a bad bargain and resents me? What if I become invisible, just another woman in a house full of women, serving a family that isn't my own?" These were the fears that had plagued her for weeks, ever since the wedding date had been finalized. She had buried them under preparations and excitement and the social obligation to appear thrilled about her future. But here in the dark, alone, they poured out like blood from a wound, uncontrollable, unstoppable, real. "What if I'm not enough?" she whispered, and her voice cracked a little on the last word. "What if I'm never enough? What if I spend my whole life trying to fit into this role and I never quite manage it? What if I look back on this, standing here tonight at 17, and realize that I was afraid for nothing, or worse, that I was afraid for good reason? What if this is the best part of my life, and I'm spending it anxious about the rest?" She moved her fingers to her temples, pressing against them as if she could physically push the thoughts back inside. But they wouldn't go. They just kept coming, wave after wave of doubt and fear and uncertainty. But underneath the fear was something else, something she barely wanted to admit. A tiny thread of curiosity. What would her husband be like? She had seen him exactly twice before today, both times in formal settings where any real conversation was impossible. He was older than her by perhaps 12 or 15 years. His name was Marcus, and she knew he had family money and respectable connections. His family had a villa outside the city. He had a brother and a sister. He was educated, had studied rhetoric, might have aspirations toward public office someday. He had never raised his voice or shown any signs of being cruel. He had, in fact, barely spoken to her at all. But perhaps that was enough. Perhaps that was all she could expect from a marriage arranged by parents who scarcely knew each other themselves before they wed. She thought about her mother, who had been married for 23 years to her father. They seemed content in the way that married people seemed content. They lived separate social lives in many ways. Her father spent his days at the forum, conducting business with clients and political allies. Her mother managed the household with capable efficiency, overseeing servants and slaves, maintaining the family's reputation and status. They shared a bed and produced 5 children together, and that seemed to be that. They were not passionate or obviously affectionate, not in the way the poets wrote about. But they were stable. They respected each other in a formal, distant sort of way. They had built a functional life together. Stable seemed like something worth striving for. Stable seemed manageable. And if her marriage was half as successful as her parents' marriage, perhaps she could make peace with it. "I will be good at this," she whispered. And as she said it, she found she almost believed it. "I will learn what I need to learn. I will do what I need to do. I will be a good wife and a good daughter-in-law. And if I'm lucky, perhaps I will even be happy, or at least content, at least not miserable." She repeated this like a prayer to the household gods, like an incantation that might make it true simply by speaking it aloud enough times. Her grandmother had once told her that women are like clay, that we can be molded and shaped into whatever form is required. But clay can be beautiful too. Clay can hold water. Clay can be made into art. Maybe she could be that. Maybe she could take the shape that was expected of her and somehow still be something worth looking at. Hours passed. She might have slept a little, though she couldn't be sure. Time had become slippery. She found herself reliving small moments from her childhood, memories that suddenly felt precious because they belonged to a version of herself that would cease to exist tomorrow. Running through the garden with her sisters, chasing butterflies, her father reading to her when she was small, his voice sonorous and serious even when the story was meant to be funny. Sitting in the kitchen with the cook, sneaking warm bread when it came out of the oven, the honey butter melting on her tongue. Small things, ordinary things, the things that made up a life before tomorrow. She rose from her bed as the sky outside her window began to lighten. She hadn't slept, or if she had, she didn't remember it. The night had passed in a kind of waking dream, somewhere between consciousness and oblivion. She moved to the window and looked out over the city of Rome, just beginning to wake. Somewhere in those streets, her husband was probably sleeping peacefully in his own home, untroubled by the enormity of what today represented. Men didn't seem to worry about such things. Or perhaps they did, and they were simply not taught to speak about it, not taught that their fears were anything worth attending to. "Today, I become someone else," she whispered one final time as the first rays of sunlight touched the tops of the buildings across the street. "Today, I leave this behind, and I'll never get this back. This girl, this person, this feeling of standing on the threshold before crossing it. Once I cross, I can't come back. I can only move forward into whatever comes next. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the window, and she let herself have one more moment of grief for the self she was about to lose. The grief was small and private and absolutely necessary. But when she heard the servants stirring, when she heard her mother's voice in the other room beginning to organize the day's activities, when she heard the familiar rhythms of the household preparing for the wedding ceremony, she steeled herself. She changed into the white wedding tunic that had been so carefully prepared. She allowed the servants to style her hair, weaving flowers through the elaborate braids. She sat still as rouge was applied to her cheeks, as oils were smoothed into her skin, as she was transformed from Livia, the girl, into Livia, the bride. And she did not let herself cry. She had done that in the darkness of the night. Now she had to be strong. As she stood before the household altar for the morning blessing, as she watched her parents exchange looks of proud satisfaction, as she heard the servants whisper about how beautiful she looked, she understood something fundamental. The girl who had whispered in the darkness had been right about one thing. You can't go back. Once you cross a threshold, once you enter adulthood fully, once you bind yourself to another person through marriage, you cannot return to who you were before. But that wasn't entirely a tragedy, because while she was losing her girlhood, she was also stepping into something new. The outcome was uncertain, sure. The future was terrifying, absolutely. But it was also, in some small way, hers to shape. Within the confines of being a Roman wife, there was still some autonomy. There was still some room for a woman to exert influence, to build a household, to be more than just a vessel. The wedding ceremony itself passed in a blur of ritual and tradition. The bride price was negotiated one final time. Vows were exchanged in Latin, words so ancient they had been spoken at thousands of weddings before hers, and would be spoken at thousands after. Her hand was placed in her husband's hand. He seemed kind enough, in that detached way that Romans cultivated. He did not smile, but he did not appear displeased either. It was what it was. A transaction conducted with the proper ceremonies, with witnesses present, with the gods appeased through offerings and prayers. It was exactly as it should be, and when it was over, when she walked out of her father's home for the last time as his daughter, when she walked into her husband's home as his wife, when she entered rooms that would now be her domain, she carried with her the memory of those whispered conversations in the dark. She carried the girl she had been into the woman she was becoming. The whispers had been her way of holding on to herself, of insisting that beneath the role, beneath the expectations, beneath the life that had been chosen for her, there was still a person, still a self-worth preserving, even if no one else ever knew about those whispers, even if she never spoke them aloud again, even if she spent the rest of her life being the perfect Roman wife, perfectly silent, perfectly obedient. Those whispers would still be hers. No one could take them away. That's what we don't often think about when we look back at history. We see the ceremonies and the structures and the rules. We see a world that seems so different from ours, so constrained, so rigid. We look at the expectations placed on women, the lack of choice, the absolute surrender of autonomy, and we feel grateful to be living in different times. And maybe we should feel grateful. But we should also remember this. Behind every ritual, behind every vow, behind every carefully arranged life, there were people. Real people with real fears and hopes and wishes. Girls and women lying awake at night, whispering to themselves into the darkness, trying to figure out how to be both who they were and who they were expected to be, trying to find space for themselves within a world that didn't necessarily make room for them, finding ways to resist, even if the resistance was only internal, even if it was only in the privacy of their own minds. And you know what? That's not so different from now. We still do that. We still try to navigate the gap between who we are and who we're supposed to be. We still lie awake at night wrestling with fear about transitions, about changes, about the future rushing toward us. We still whisper our doubts and hopes into the darkness, hoping that somehow, by speaking them aloud, we might make them more manageable. We still grieve the selves we're leaving behind, even as we step forward into who we're becoming. Roman brides did it 2,000 years ago. We do it now. And probably, people 2,000 years in the future will still be doing it too. Because that's what it means to be human. It's not about the time period or the culture or the specific circumstances. It's about the fundamental experience of standing at a threshold and trying to hold two versions of yourself in tension at once. The person you were and the person you're becoming. And finding, somewhere in the space between those two identities, enough courage to take the next step. Whether it's a wedding day or a college acceptance or a new job or a move to a new city or any of the 1,000 transitions that life throws at us, we're all standing where Livia stood. We're all trying to hold on to who we were while becoming who we need to be. We're all whispering our fears to the darkness. We're all hoping that somehow, when we wake up tomorrow, we'll be ready for what comes next. We're all doing the same calculus she did, trying to figure out if we're equipped for the change that's about to happen. And the answer, usually, is that we're not sure. But we do it anyway. So when you think about that Roman bride on her final night as a maiden, when you imagine her whispers in the darkness, remember that those whispers were just as real and just as important as anything else that happened in that moment. They were the most authentic part of her transition, not the ceremony, not the vows, not the external trappings, not the flowers in her hair or the prayers spoken on her behalf, but those quiet moments alone when she allowed herself to be honest, to be afraid, to be vulnerable, to be human. That's what matters. That's what always matters. The quiet conversations we have with ourselves when no one's watching, when we think no one will ever know. Those are the moments that define us. Those are the moments that, thousands of years later, still reach across time and touch our hearts because we recognize ourselves in them. Because we know exactly what she was feeling, even though we've never met her and we're separated from her by 2 millennia. And that's beautiful. That's the thread that connects all of us across time. The shared experience of being human, of being afraid, of being brave anyway.